Thank you very much, Robin. Put these here. Slide off. So it was great last night that so many people put their hands up to indicate that they hadn't been to an SPUC conference before, which is really encouraging for us. So I want to start by just giving a little bit of an introduction about Safe at School, so you know what this project is all about. So those who know very well what it's about, if you'll bear with me for a few minutes. So the Safe at School campaign was started probably about 6 or 7 years ago in direct response to parents getting in touch with the society concerned about what their children were being taught in school, both at primary and secondary level. And when we looked into, listened to the parents, we looked into the types of materials that were being used to teach children in sex education lessons, we could see that there was a problem. We were also listening very carefully to parents, and nearly all of them were saying things to us like, we haven't been told about this sex education, the school isn't explaining to us, we're being given very late notice about these lessons, and so on and so forth. And they were feeling very sidelined, very excluded from this really critical aspect of their child's development. And what we could see happening was basically a situation where children were being sexualized by this material and their parents were being sidelined. And ultimately, this anti-life, anti-family ideology that was running through all these sex education programs, we realized would just close the hearts and minds of this next generation to the pro-life message. So we really had to involve ourselves in this area. So Safe at School really does two main things. We take a very strong stand against any moves to make sex education a compulsory school subject. So the situation at the moment is that it's not a compulsory school subject, although I would say nearly every school does teach some sort of sex education, but I'll explain later why it's so important that we do oppose it becoming a statutory school subject. So that's one aspect of the work we do. The other is that we advise and support parents who get in touch with us because they're facing difficulties. And when we first advertise this service to parents, well, I really didn't think that this would be the main part of the Safe at School work, but that is what has happened. And interestingly, parents find me by going on the internet. They're concerned about what's happening at school, and my name pops up, and I get calls from all sorts of people from all over the country who are concerned. And then it is, on occasion, they are people who have got a connection with SPUC in some way, but very many parents not. And it's really across the board that I hear from parents. I hear from parents who, during the course of the conversation, it becomes very apparent that they are living in quite difficult social circumstances. And I hear from parents who are spending thousands of pounds on their children's education. So this is something that's running through the entire education system. I preface my talk by saying that not every school has taken up the sort of full sex education agenda, as you might say, and I, of course, am only hearing of the worst cases. But I think it's true to say that in almost every school there is something being taught, and it is constantly surprising when parents get in touch with me and say, oh, my child's at a lovely little Catholic school, and I wanted to find out, what was being taught. And it transpires that along with the nice Catholic programme, they're showing quite explicit videos of sexual activity. So it's really only when, a parent starts to ask the questions that we find out, actually, there are unhappy things happening in these schools. And I've had cases where not even the head teacher has been aware that year after year certain things have been shown in the classroom. So it's, not every school is as bad as every other, but schools, this aggressive government policy to get sex education into schools means that nearly all schools are affected by this. And the other thing I want to say is that this is not and has never been a campaign attacking teachers. Most of the parents who get in touch with me are at pains to say that how lovely their child's school is in almost every other respect, and somehow things have just gone drastically wrong when it comes to sex education. Why are they doing that? And that the teachers do believe that what they're doing is for the benefit of the children. So the teachers are not sort of, there's no sort of premeditated, in most cases, sort of premeditated, wanting to damage children. They think that this is what they should be doing. So that's a sort of just a bit of an introduction to what Safe at School is all about. But I thought I'd start off by just giving you a case study. So this was one phone call that I received from a mother in about April of this year. And she was very distressed. So the situation with this family, they had moved house in 2015, and in September 2015, the children had started at a new village primary school. At the children's previous primary school, they had received no sex education. She didn't know whether that was coming up later on for them or not, but the children hadn't received any sex education. So I'll call her Emily, the eldest child in this family. She starts in year 5. She's aged 9 years of old, and year 5 is the sort of penultimate year of primary school. And at the time I was talking to the mother, she said, looking back, she realised that almost from day one, Emily's behaviour had started to change. She had started mentioning, referring to sexual body parts, which sort of seemed to come out of the blue, and asking to watch television programmes that she'd never wanted to watch before, and her mother didn't really like. And all sorts of other sort of sexual allusions, and she just felt that something wasn't quite right. So she went to the school and asked about, what sex education is taught in the school, and it turned out that the school used the programme Living and Growing, which many of you will have heard me speak about before. This is a very, very widely used resource. It's actually quite old now. It's been around for about 12 or 13 years. Produced by Channel 4. And it's sort of become a gold standard of sex education material in primary schools. And it contains a number of very explicit animated depictions of sexual intercourse. It looks at masturbation, all sorts of other issues, and I won't go into all of that now, but it is highly explicit, and extracts from Living and Growing pop up in so many different programs that I've looked at, including, I'm afraid to say, in some Catholic programs, and it's a very damaging and disturbing teaching resource. And one of the sections in this Living and Growing programme is a section, Let's Talk About Sex. And that really goes to the heart of what this programme does. It's getting children talking about sex and thinking about sex. And this is the general thrust of the sex education lobby, which wants sex to be a normal and everyday part of life. That's how they want, and pleasurable part of life. That's how they want it to be presented to children. Well, it is a normal and pleasurable part of everyday life. If you're a married adult, it is not if you're a child. So this is what they're using in this little primary school, and they've seen some of this material in the summer term, and by September they're still talking about it, and they're talking about it to Emily. Emily is also coming home and informing her family that, well, my teacher said we must remember that now men can marry men and women can marry women, and when we're talking about marriage, we can't just be thinking about a man and a woman. So you're getting the picture of what's happening. So things came to a bit of a head in Emily's class when the children were put in groups around a tablet, little computer, for a science lesson, and the teacher tells them to type in reproduction in plants. This is what we're going to look at, and we're going to look at what they've got. We're going to look at the resources on the tablet, and reproduction in plants is indeed part of the primary science curriculum. So Emily's in her little group, and a little boy in her group, instead of typing in reproduction in plants, he types in naked bodies, and up on the screen pops we don't know what. Possibly nothing too explicit, but it was enough to shock Emily, who runs to her teacher and says, we've got pictures of this on our tablet, and the teacher tells her to go and sit down. Now, Emily's mother thinks that probably the teacher did more than that in all eventuality, but that, in Emily's mind, that's what happened. She saw this, she went to her teacher and she was told to sit down, so that's the message that Emily's getting. So here's a 9-year-old boy in the classroom under his teacher's nose, typing in naked bodies and looking at presumably naked bodies, and it does make you wonder what he's typing into his computer at home. So this is we hear about children being sexualised, and this is the way in which they are being sexualised. And of course, it's not just what is in the classroom. We're living in a highly sexualised culture, so we can't pin it all on sex education, but formalising let's talk about sex in the context of a classroom situation where children are in learning mode is very, very potent. So Emily's parents go to see the school, and the school does admit, actually we haven't got as many filters in place as we should have, and it's very difficult, so on and so forth. A few weeks later, Emily comes home very excited because they're doing a project where they can take the tablets into the playground. They put an hour in the playground, and they can photograph whatever they want for an art project. And given the fairly toxic environment of that classroom, Emily's mother thinks, no, I'm not letting my child in the playground for an hour with a camera and these boys and girls photographing whatever they want. And in fact, it was on that very day that she telephoned me, very distressed. What was she going to do? In the event, she said, we've been thinking more and more about homeschooling, and that, I believe, is what she did. She didn't feel she could battle on with this situation. And she told me the name of the school, and I went onto their website, and you look at the website and the leafy Surrey and the rolling green fields in the background, and prosperous looking children, and you wouldn't think there was any problem there, but there is. So my point here is that sex education brings sex into the classroom and it sexualises children. That is the trajectory there. And we've got toxic classrooms because we've got a toxic culture. We've got sex promoted as casual, recreational activity. Any form of sex is fine, even desirable, as long as it's consensual. That's the bottom line. If it's not consensual, if you haven't agreed to it, then this is terrible. But if you've agreed to it, anything goes. The de facto age of sexual consent is 13 years old, and we have this deep contradiction in society where children are considered mature enough to be able to give consent to take and use contraception long before they are able to have sex legally. And Professor David Payton, to whom I'll just pay a brief tribute for the fantastic support as an academic that he gives to SPUC and other pro-life, pro-family groups, keeps us absolutely up to date with latest studies in this area. So thank you, David. And in a scorching letter to the Times, he wrote, "No 13-year-old child should ever be considered mature enough to consent to sexual activity, and it's time for the government to make this clear to health professionals." And I think he's absolutely right. So we have this toxic culture. We have no national culture of regarding sex as part of a loving, lifelong commitment within marriage. Instead, the message to young people is that it's neither possible nor even desirable, really, to control your sexual impulses. And as a society, we are now starting to reap the disastrous consequences. Well, we have been reaping them for some time, but I want to focus on one particular manifestation of how disastrously wrong things can go when we have this sort of culture around sexual morality. And I want to refer to the child abuse scandals that have hit the headlines in recent years. So we've heard about Rotherham, we've heard about Rochdale, we've heard about Oxfordshire, and all the grisly details of these scandals that have come to the surface when the serious case reviews have been published. So in February 2015, we were all shocked when we read reports on the publication of the serious case review in Oxfordshire. This was 370 girls who'd been the victims of child sexual exploitation over a period of 16 years. You know, how did this happen on such a scale and for such a long time? Why didn't people see what was there? Why wasn't the appropriate action taken? And there were three aspects which emerged from these serious case reviews, which I think are very pertinent to the topic that I'm talking about. And this was all widely reported in the press. So the first was a confusion related to a national culture where children are sexualised at an ever younger age, a professional tolerance, say the writers of this report, to knowing young teenagers were having sex with adults seemed to have developed. So we live in a sexually confused society. Nobody really knows where the boundaries were. The review also highlights upon the fact that parents were sidelined and that there was insufficient understanding of parental reaction to their children's behaviour and the fact that they were missing. So distraught, desperate and terrified parents were sometimes seen as part of the problem. And remember that these are families that are already in very difficult circumstances. A number of these girls were in care, but still the parents were, and these are the words of the report, distraught, desperate and terrified. And the parents were just put on one side, didn't know what was happening to their children. But arguably, what left these girls most vulnerable is this thinking that children have sexual rights and that their rights trump any adult intervention to protect them. And I just quote the Family Education Trust, who said in their press statement at the time, in addition to the casual attitude to underage sex and the exclusion of parents, the third ingredient in the cocktail which left the child protection agencies paralysed was a fatal spirit of non-judgmentalism, which regards young people as autonomous agents who must be left entirely free to make their own choices. So we have nobody really, sexualised young people, everybody's confused sexually, parents are sidelined, and children's rights trump everything else. And when I look through sex education programmes that are produced for schools, I find content that is sexualising children, an approach which sidelines parents, and the sex education lobby are absolutely clear that what children need are experts to teach them about sex, and those experts are not their parents. And sex is presented to children and teenagers as something that they are entitled to. It's your right to sex education, and it's your right to have to express your sexuality. So you can see where these lines of thought are travelling, and it may seem that there's no connection between a sunny primary school in Surrey and the dark corners of Rochdale Rotherham and Oxford, where this child sex abuse was taking place, but they are much closer than we think. And my reason for sort of taking you down this little route, thinking about child sex abuse, is because the number one reason now which is being pushed to justify introducing compulsory sex education is child abuse. We must have compulsory sex education in order to stop child abuse. And yet, nobody is connecting the dots, and the very things that are being promoted in classrooms are helping to create the environment in which sexual exploitation can flourish. And at this point, I'd just say that Norman Wells of the Family Education Trust is preparing what I think will be a very important document, looking in much more detail at these serious case reviews and examining all the underlying factors that have been feeding into this tragic situation of child abuse. My own small contribution to this project is to encourage him to, was in the first place to encourage him to write it and to encourage him to finish it, which I believe will be sometime this autumn. So I'm sure we'll be promoting that on our website and in other areas, because we need to get to grips with this topic. So the pressure to make sex education a compulsory school subject is growing. In 2016, it's just been one issue after another. Sexting, female genital mutilation, women delaying babies, having children for too long, sexual violence and harassment in schools. You know, almost every month there's some new group identifying a problem that's affecting young people, and the answer is always get the schools to deal with it, and in order to get the schools to deal with it properly, we must make sex education compulsory. There is never any serious or concrete proposals that actually parents, that actually families have a role in dealing with these problems, and there is this shift to get the state to deal with these problems that are affecting young people, and the family is very much on the sidelines. And one of the aspects of the Safe at School campaign is that we are promoting and pushing for parents and families to be central in these critical areas of their children's upbringings. And parents are a huge resource, and the government is just not interested in families helping to deal with this. It is a sort of state takeover. Sexual violence and sexual harassment in schools was the subject of an inquiry launched earlier this year by the Women and Equalities Committee in the House of Commons. So SPUC Safe at School made a submission to that inquiry, and our main point was that children and teenagers at school would be better supported and better be able to better deal with sexual violence and harassment, both online and offline, if their parents were better informed and better supported in protecting their children. And our proposal, which will be ignored, I'm sure, that schools have a role in supporting and engaging with parents to take these issues up with their children, and not just leave the school to do it. Well, that was that was basically our position on that. And of course, you know, we knew before this report had even come out, their primary recommendation to the government would be that sex education was made compulsory. On the very day, in fact, that this Women and Equalities Committee published their report on sexual violence and sexual harassment in schools, I also received an email which was a press report about a group of parents in a school in North London who were at primary school in North London, who were protesting about the introduction of mixed-sex toilets in their children's primary school. And the number one reason these parents were really concerned about mixed-sex toilets was because they felt it put their children at risk of sexual assault. And, I can't think of any place in a school where sexual violence and harassment is likely to take place than in mixed-sex toilets. But I'd bet any money that we'll never hear the Women and Equalities Committee saying that mixed-sex toilets are not are anything but a great idea. And in fact, this is a problem, and I have this year, in fact, already received a couple of calls from families who are concerned about mixed-sex toilets in their children's school. And one family, a Polish family actually, that got in touch with me. Their children were at a mixed Roman Catholic comprehensive school. They contacted me in July in the last school year, and the school was reviewing its policy about toilet facilities because a transgender child was joining the school in September, and they felt they had to do something to accommodate this child. So there's 1,000 pupils and one transgender child is coming into the school. In the event, I think the school, they said to me the school realised that lots of parents were not happy about this, so they've introduced open plan toilets. I don't know quite what that means, but apparently the sexes are still separated, but they call them anyway. This, I'm just touching upon this transgender issue here because that is another huge area of which is creeping into schools, the whole transgender agenda. But there isn't time here to cover all of that. So schools, are becoming the sort of focus of all these really pernicious, damaging ideologies that are all travelling in and through our schools. So why is this so important to the pro-life mission? Well, as we said we've been saying from the beginning that, if we have this explicit, provocative, anti-life sex education in families, it is, in schools rather, it is undermining families. And where families are weak, the culture of death will thrive. And the most dangerous aspect of this whole anti-life sex education agenda is this deliberate removing of parents from this part of their child's development. And this is just growing and growing, that we need experts, we need specialists. This is, anybody is better than the child's parents to deal with, to teach them about these issues. So we have the Sex Education Forum, the PSHE Association, the NSPCC, teaching unions, and I'm afraid to say churches of all denominations who are sidelining parents. And when children become detached from the moral, the morality of their parents, it does make them very vulnerable. And frankly, this is, one of the many things that is feeding the abortion industry. They're very difficult for children for whom sex is just fun and anything goes to resist abortion, basically. I think I've got time just very briefly just to touch on something that the NSPCC, which is has got an increasing outreach into schools, particularly primary schools. And again, it's around this issue of we must protect children from child abuse. So they have these very appealing, colourful teaching materials and glove puppets and all sorts of things to go into schools to teach children that to be they have this pants project, private, your private parts are private and all the rest of it. There's a nod to parents, this is good if parents reinforce this at home. But in fact, only this last week, a mother got in touch with me, wanted me to look at the latest NSPC initiative, which was coming into her child's school. And I read through this, and every lesson that the children were having was a video about a child who was in very distressing circumstance. So every child's watching a little film about another child in a very unhappy situation. And the upshot of every lesson is call Childline. And there's a song about how they to remember the Childline number, and everything is directed towards Childline. And the mother that called me said, what disturbed her most was that the only reference to adults in this NSPC program, and she got the whole thing and she sent it to me to look at, the only reference to adults was as abusers. And parents were not mentioned once in this program. And while I am sure there have been some, Childline has helped children in very desperate situations, most children are not in a desperate situation. And the really sinister thing about the NSPCC program is call us with any problem, however great or small. And it's not the dealing with the big problems, it's the fact, call us with any problem, however small it is. So, I've fallen out with my best friend, or she looked at me in a funny way, call Childline. Those are issues that children should be going back to their parents with, not calling up Childline. So it's a massive sort of propaganda. And interestingly, the parent who contacted me is a paediatrician, and she said that actually, from my caseload, I'm not convinced that the cases that I see would have come to the surface as a result of this. The teachers recognise they don't need this programme in order to spot where there are the problems with children. So that's the another sort of aspect of this whole problem. So this is an issue for the pro-life movement. We ignore what's happening to children in the classroom at our peril, and we need to look after the future generation. And something that is so systematically undermining and attacking families, attacking sexual morality in children at this very young age has to be our concern. And Safe at School, I hope you will agree, still has a continuing role in the pro-life movement. And in actual fact, Safe at School has been involved in setting up a coalition of groups in order to share resources, share information, and actually be ready when, I would say, there is a move to make sex education compulsory. So there's Family Education Trust, Lovewise, who are coming this morning to deliver one of the workshops. And we're working very closely with Christian Concern and the Christian Institute organisations I'm sure you'll be familiar with. But SPUC will have a leading role. We will be the leaders, I would say, when we come to tackle any legislation trying to make sex education compulsory, because we've got 50 years of campaigning experience. Time and again, when we get into action, we can produce huge numbers of people who write to their MPs. People really, we're masters of running political campaigns, and we will definitely be in the lead there. We have this role, and we will be. We have the Safer School puts out information from time to time, and we'll be keeping everybody up to date with developments as they happen. And with this whole issue of compulsory sex education, it is so dangerous because though the sex education lobby says, we must have sex education in every school, the fact is that nearly every school is teaching some sort of education. It's not the fact of whether schools are teaching sex education or not, it's what they are teaching the children. And everything is pointing to, once it's made compulsory, it will just open the floodgates even further for the sort of anti-life, anti-family, corrupting and damaging materials that will be unleashed upon our children. So what happens in classrooms is very much a part of the pro-life mission. And I'll just end with a quotation from the gay rights champion Patricia Nell Warren, who said, "It is the first fact of civilization. Whoever captures the kids owns the future. Ladies and gentlemen, it's got to be us." Thank you.